Let's roll, man.
All right. Well, I'll keep letting people in as they show up to the waiting room. But today we've got best practices for boards of directors. We'll be focused on Mark Zweig and what his experiences have taught him. Over the course of Mark's career, Mark has worked with AEC firms from virtually all sizes and types throughout the US and abroad, and has helped them solve just about every problem. Including working with their board of directors, developing strategies, turnarounds, partner separations, organizational restructuring, mergers and acquisitions, and re-engineering marketing. Uh, all of these have built him up to where he's at in his career today. So I'm going to pass him off and always enjoy hearing from Mark. So let's be ready for that discussion during the second half of the session, and let's listen to what Mark has to say.
Hey, thanks, Chad. It's great to be here with everybody. And hopefully we'll be able to make this as entertaining as possible and educational as well as you stare at your screens for the next hour or so. One of many Zoom meetings I'm in today, and probably the same for you all. Seems to be the way business is done today. Ah, I am I'm having a problem here with my presentation. Okay, here we go. So what are we going to talk about today? Uh, who I am and what qualifies me to speak to you all about this topic. What is the purpose of the board in a privately held firm, specifically here
Hey,
we go.
Mark. Yes, sorry
How
about
do,
that.
that's okay. Where did you lose me? So what is the purpose of a board in a privately held firm? How do AE firms screw up their boards and board meetings? That's always fun, and there's plenty to talk about. How to have a better board. That's really what you want to know. Outside directors, we're going to talk about that. And then we'll have a little discussion and Q&A after about 30 minutes or so, or however long it takes me to get through this. I want to answer anybody's question that comes up, or respond to any comments that you have. So who am I and what qualifies me to speak to you all today? Well, I've been working in the AE business for 40 years as an owner, consultant, and advisor to more than 1,000 companies, and it pretty much dealt with every issue that these businesses face. Um, I'm the founder of two companies on the Inc. 500, 5,000 list. Zweig Group, which has been on the list 3 times and during 2 different periods of ownership. And then Mark Zweig Inc., which is my design, build, development, and contracting company. Has been on the list once. Um, I'm a founder or co-founder of 3 other businesses. I've been a partner or owner in 4 privately held AE firms, and I served on the boards as a voting director in 10 private companies, all AE firms of one sort or another. Served on 3 different university boards, and that's a twist on this whole board deal is nonprofits. I currently serve on a nonprofit organization's board. It's fair to say I've seen a lot in this 40 years I've been doing this stuff. It's amazing. I used to be the young guy, and now I'm the old guy in the room. I guess that happens to all of us at some point. So, what is the purpose of a board in a privately held firm? There are many different elements of it, but these are some that I think are most important. Looking out for shareholder or owner well-being, dealing with all ownership related issues. Who's going to be a stockholder? Do we need to change the valuation methodology? How are we going to afford to buy Bill back based on these terms that are in the buy sell agreement? Anything related to ownership. How much new stock do we need to sell next year to replace the capital that's exiting the firm? These are all typical board issues. Vetting of offers to sell or merge or buy other firms. The board is certainly involved in the sell side of the equation, but many times they also participate in the decision to merge or buy another firm. Selection of additional owners. It's typically a board function. The shareholders may nominate people, but generally speaking, the board is the one that actually makes the decision on who gets to buy into the company. Selection of the CEO and other officers, typical board function. And I say other officers, I'm talking about the treasurer and the secretary. Supervision of the CEO. The CEO reports to the board. Development and monitoring of a strategic plan. That is typically a board function. Dealing with unplanned expenditures or financial crises. And certainly I've had to do that many times. Dealing with unplanned liability issues. I mean, it's almost always a standing agenda on a sizable firm's board is the liability issues that they're facing. Setting company policy. Hiring of auditors if the firm uses auditors, and certainly not all companies have audited financials. Plus, optionally, setting owner salaries, determining how profits are dealt with, how much are we going to retain versus how much are we paying out to owners in the form of distributions or dividends versus the employee / management bonus pools. So many times that's a decision of the board, not necessarily who gets how much, but where the money goes, to what pool. Determining stock value annually. I don't advise this practice, yet some firms do it. They literally sit down and discuss what they think the value of the company should be for the coming year. Mentoring the CEO, that's certainly is something I think the board should do. They don't always do it, but it's a very valuable role that board members can play. So, how do AE firms screw up their boards and their board meetings? And this will be the rest of the presentation. No, I'm kidding. I should use my little portable laugh track that I use in my classes. It's been a very handy device to have. I bought it on Amazon. So they put every owner on the board. These are all things I've seen more than once. And that gets really interesting when the firm has 30 owners and there's 30 people on the board. The board has too many directors. Again, the more people you have doing this, the more difficult it gets to achieve consensus and make decisions. Directors are the people who've been there the longest versus those who can best contribute to the big picture. That's another problem I see. I've seen many examples where there were people who were on the board only because they had the greatest tenure, and yet they never made a contribution, even years of observing these people. They simply never made a single contribution to anything that was meaningful and as it relates to the board. That's a problem. Meanwhile, there were other people who maybe could have been much better contributors in the ranks. They act as if the board has to have representation from each discipline or geographic office of the firm. It's like old Joe is retiring and he was the head of MEP services, so our next board member has to come out of MEP. Or, Sue is leaving us and she was the Houston office manager, and so we need to have someone from Houston on the board to represent the interests of the Houston staff. That is not the way a board in a business is supposed to work. There's no diversity on the board. Gosh, I think every board I ever got on practically met this, was in this situation. Members are all 50-plus-year-old white guys who grew up in the firm. That's a problem. And diversity is not just for political correctness' sake, believe me. The diversity really improves the quality of decision making and creativity of the group, having people with different backgrounds. Every board I ever got on, one of the first things I did was make sure we had at least one woman on the board, because women do view things differently, and it's very helpful to have their perspective. They hold too many board meetings. You know, it's like once a month, we're going to have a meeting, 2-day meeting. I've actually seen that in a firm. It was what company I did a turnaround on, and eventually became very successful. But when I started working with them, they had all shareholders on the board. The board met monthly, and the board met for 2 days. Now, can you imagine the lost productivity of a group that size? It was absolutely insane. And the quality of decision making was slower and worse with all those people involved. They don't hold any board meetings. Some companies have boards, but the board meeting minutes are cooked up by the attorneys at the end of the year, and it really doesn't mean anything. So, because it hasn't been held. The board meetings are too long. You know, 2 days is insane. Maybe once a year for some sort of retreat, that could make sense. But as a regular standing meeting that long, even a day and a half, too long. And let me just add, by the way, that one of the problems when meetings are too long is that not only is it a waste of time, very valuable and expensive people's time, but they tend to get into the operational aspects of the firm and start interfering with the day-to-day managers. That's not good. Here's another one. Again, almost every board I joined of an established company had this problem. They spend half or more of the board meeting reviewing financial history. That's crazy. They get sucked into operational matters versus leaving that to the operational management. I already mentioned that as a problem. They don't have any outside directors, so they're all from inside the company. Many of them have never worked anywhere else. No perspective, no connection with the marketplace, no idea of how other companies are doing things. Not good. They spend time on matters such as determining specific bonuses for every employee in the firm. That is an operational issue. It's really not a board issue. I mean, they need to be in control of the rewards. They don't have an agenda that they stick to. They may have no agenda, and if they do have one, they don't stick to it. They don't keep good meeting minutes. So after the meeting, nobody can remember exactly what was said or what decisions were made. That's a problem. And they don't communicate with management or employees after the board meetings. When you have a board meeting and the employees are aware of it, everybody's out of the office or they're all in the conference room, people want some communication. If you don't give it to them, then they automatically assume there's some kind of bad news or something being hidden from them. And that's bad for morale. So, how to have a better board? Here are some thoughts that come to my mind. First thing, take a look at everything I pointed out that firms do wrong and just don't do it. That may sound obvious, but I would imagine many of the people in this room would, if honest, admit that they do some of these things that I just spelled out here. It might make an interesting survey question in the future, Chad. They have an odd number of directors. Always good. Not to say that we want to vote on everything. We really want consensus. But if it absolutely comes down to it, it's good to have an odd number of directors. Shareholders vote shares to elect directors. The goal is to have unanimity. So the shareholders vote. If I've got 20% of the shares, I get 20% of the votes. But once on the board, it's one vote for one director. I like staggered terms. I think a 2-year term staggered, so half the board or so changes out potentially every year, at least there's an opportunity to do so, is good. It's better than doing it so they all leave at the same time, because you could end up with a real problem if that happened. There'd be no continuity. So as I already said, once on the board, one person equals one vote. I like a quarterly schedule of 4 to 6 hour meetings. I think that's frequent enough. And you can get done the real board business if you don't waste half your time reviewing the past financial history. That should be adequate, and maybe it'll keep the board focused on board matters and not encourage them to stray into talking about operational matters like, what are we going to do about Sue over in the Dallas office? Or, we've got this one job we're trying to win. What should who do we need to call over there? I mean, that's the kind of stuff it's day-to-day operational management. Have a lunch or dinner the night before the meetings to get the chit chat out of the way. I think if you don't do that, then you're going to waste time in the meeting. So it's always good to catch up on, who's doing what's happening in your life. Generally, how's the business doing the day, either at lunch before the meeting or the night before the meeting. Have a report that goes out to all board members each month detailing the financial performance of the firm. So we're only meeting quarterly, but on a monthly basis, we're seeing how the firm is doing. Again, there's not much worse than no communication during the quarter. You arrive at the meeting, then you find out how they're actually doing. That's crazy. Why have surprises? Why not be able to make mid-course corrections or provide advice along the way? That's why I like to schedule a 1-hour call each month to talk about anything that needs discussing. I find that 1 hour is really critical. And again, maybe we can make some mid-course corrections, or at least be thinking about what the big issues are that we're going to have to deal with at the next meeting. I like to develop a preliminary agenda at least a week before the meeting and share that with everybody, the other board members, to get their input on it. That way they make sure they all have a chance to put something on the agenda that they think needs to go on there, or to perhaps discuss why something shouldn't be on the agenda. Send out all the financials prior to the meeting. I like to see them at least a week before. That way, a standing meeting agenda item can be, are there any questions on the financials? After we approve the prior meeting's minutes, then the next thing is going to be any questions on the financials. If not, we go right into the meat of the meeting. Man, that saves a tremendous amount of time. I like to always include a future-oriented topic. Let's use these bright minds effectively. Let's not just deal with problems and things that happened in the past. Get their input on the future. I've been on the boards of companies with some really smart people, CEOs of businesses not in the AE world, people who were CEOs of the largest design firms in the world, people who were the chairman of the largest engineering firm in the nation. I mean, some of these people have a lot to offer, and to just have them reviewing financial histories and then pondering who gets how much on their bonus that year is not the best way to use their talent. I've already alluded to this, but you got to get the best contributors to the overall firm management on the board, whoever they are. Not just the people who've been there the longest or necessarily have the most ownership. We really need to look down in the ranks, and oftentimes there's some brilliant, intelligent, well tuned in to what's going on in the world people that may be better off on the board than somebody who's essentially retired on the job. I like to have the CFO, as a regular attendee of all meetings, but not necessarily a voting board member. I mean, they need to be there to answer questions. They need to be there to find information that people ask for and weigh in on critical issues. But I don't think they necessarily need to be a voting board member. We can have them there as an advisor. I would suggest you add at least one or two outsiders to your board. I've actually been on the board of one large company, Ellerby Beckett. And while I was on their board, they had a shareholder vote to make sure that the majority of board members were outsiders. That's very unusual for a firm in this business, but they felt they couldn't govern themselves effectively the way they were going. And now I will say one of the negative outcomes of that was the firm was sold not long after that to AECOM. But in any case, having at least one or two outsiders, there's so much they can do. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So let's get into that. Outside directors, I mean, they can be absolutely one of the best resources that you can have. I would look for people who can either bring work to the firm or experience growing a company in this business. They are certainly a pool that you should be looking into. I'll never forget, I was on the board of a company based in Southern California, and it was predominantly a California company. I mean, they had offices in various places in California, but most of their work was on the West Coast. And they had an opportunity to do a large internet building in Denver. And one of our board members, who happened to be a former he was a retired U.S. Navy admiral. When this topic came up about this big opportunity to do a project in Denver, he said, "Oh, are you dealing with so and so over there?" And one of the other members of the board said, "Yeah, that's who we're talking to." He said, "I know that guy well. We were both, in the Navy at the same time." Because I'm going to Denver next week. I'll be glad to stop in and see him if you'd like. They got that job, and they never would have gotten it if it hadn't been for that outside director who had a connection to that organization. And that's one of many cases I've seen. Consider adding someone from a key client or client type. While on the one hand, it could be embarrassing for them to see what's really going on in the company. If you're not proud of every aspect of your management or financial performance, they can do a lot of good for you if you get the right one. Consider former regulators who still have connections to their former agency. I mean, that could be critical to what you do, depending on the markets that you work in. Consider people who've been very successful in another industry. Look, guys, the fact is, in this business, we don't always have the best management practices. We're a little slow to pick up on stuff. Sometimes, I mean, I'll never forget when TQM was the rage in the 90s. The rest of American industry gave up on it in the 70s. And, it was discovered by the AE industry as a new thing. And of course, it didn't really take hold in our business either. But I think when you have people that come from some other industries, they may be doing things better than we are. And it's always good to have a little cross pollination there. If your board lacks diversity, find outsiders who can bring that to you. I already gave you the reasons for that. Have D&O insurance, and that stands for Directors and Officers Insurance. It's not costly. Any outside director will require it. I would never sit on the board of a company where you can be sued personally and without having D&O insurance. It'd be crazy. So look into that. You should do it whether you have outside directors or not, by the way. Pay your outside directors. The range is typically somewhere between $20,000 and $100,000 a year. At least that was my experience on the companies, the boards I sat on. In some cases, firms offer stock or stock options to buy in at a reduced price. And that was certainly an incentive, I can tell you. I've also worked in firms where I took my entire compensation in the form of stock, but it was always worth at least $20,000. But when you consider some of the people I served with as outside directors on companies in our business and their experience, if you could pay $20,000 a year to get somebody who's been the CEO of the largest design firm on your board, I mean, there's no, the value is far, far greater than 20,000. So I think you need to ponder that. Include your outside directors in all firm-related communications. Keep them informed on what's going on in the company. They can see the emails or reports, and it may be helpful to them to do so. Employ your outside directors to do staff training or conduct an occasional meeting with your managers. It's just another way you can get a little more out of them. While they're in town for the board meeting, hey, why don't you meet with our BD staff and talk about what your experience is selling this stuff or whatever their background is. So that's all I had to present. And now we're going to open it up to Q&A. Chad, do you want to read any questions that we have, or how will we do this?
So we did not have any specific questions come in through the chat during the first portion, but if anyone wants to tee up a question for Mark, just get over there and you can either privately send it to us or send it out to everyone. We'll let Mark respond and then open it up for any response from the audience after that. So do we have a sample BOD agenda, which came in? And so what I've got pulled up in my Adobe here is actually a copy of our Board of Directory Advisory for AEC manual. And that is something that we can potentially find in there. So let me dig in there and maybe we can take a couple other questions and see if I can find something for us. Here's one from Daryl Bray. Who should make the financial decisions on choosing outside directors? How do you avoid it being someone handpicked by the CEO who will in effect just be a yes man for the CEO?
Well, the board has to make that decision. It's not the CEO's job. I mean, I would think, that any of the board members could suggest or bring forth candidates, and you need some sort of a process to select the right one. But assuming the CEO is on the board, which they aren't necessarily, but assuming they are, because it's typical in a firm in this business, I would say they've only got one vote, and the other directors have to make sure that it's not somebody who's just going to be a yes man. I do see that as a problem. Many times when you get the regular outside accountants or regular outside attorney as your outside director, that's exactly what you're going to get, is somebody who's going to go along with whatever management wants because they're getting paid by management. They can't afford to alienate them.
Okay. Let's see, we've got a few more coming in here at a pretty good rate. You mentioned the CFO attending the board meetings. How many non-board managers would you invite?
Well, I would certainly have the CEO, as I said, as one. Some firms like to have a rotation of a younger person to come into the meetings. There's pluses and minuses with that. I think it's good. It gives them some education on how the firm does business and manages itself. At the same time, there may be things that just aren't appropriate for them to hear. but I have
So
seen
we've got
that done frequently.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions about small firms. Most small
Okay.
firms don't typically use a board directly correctly. Do you have any specific advice for a small firm that's developing a board? What is your advice for just looking to do cleanup of their management practices?
I mean, it's a great place to have outside directors. When I started working with one company, they had a total of 8 or 9 employees, and there were 3 of us on the board who were outside directors. Today, the place is doing about 30 million a year and has 20 offices in various places around the globe. So, I don't think, I think if you want to be a growing company in a larger firm, then, maybe having that board. And when you think about the people, in this case, we had the former CEO of the largest firm in the industry that does what these people did. We had the CEO of the largest, former CEO, rather, in both cases, of the largest architecture firm, and then myself. And we were all getting, somewhere around $20,000 a year, if I recall. For $60,000, do you think that'd be a good resource for a small firm? When you talk about a growth playbook, I mean, these people were invaluable, really, as to what they brought to this company and the success and the mentoring of the CEO along the way. And it's been a tremendous success.
Okay. What's your opinion on the CEO or president of the firm also being the chairman of the board of directors?
It's not uncommon in a small company that's privately held where that person has the majority of ownership. I think it'd be naive to say that that's not normal. Is it necessarily the best practice? I don't know. But I think it's very typical, and it would be what I would expect in a small firm that's probably still in its first generation where there's ownership concentrated in that person.
Sure. What do you say about firms that are quote unquote everyone on the board is an owner? So any principal of the firm is also on the board, and those groups are the one and the same.
It's a disaster. I mean, you can't really talk about what you need to talk about because you may have some people in the room who are problems. You certainly increase your probabilities of that. Slows down decision making, takes a lot of time. In fact, every single turnaround I ever did on a firm in this business, I found that there were too many people on the board and the board had too many meetings. And, I'm thinking about one in particular where they had 20 shareholders and all 20 were on their board. And the first thing we did was we shrank the board to 5 people. And the board was meeting monthly. We made it quarterly. They also had a really disastrous co CEO troika, which I can't even say a single good thing about, where the founder of the company would not name a successor. So he named 3 people to take his place. We had the oldest guy who'd been there the longest, who never said a thing. We had the guy who was the yes man and told the founder everything he wanted to hear. And then we had the guy who sold like 70% of the work, but was very quiet. We first thing we did is once we shrank the board to 5 people, we then had the board elect a new CEO. And fortunately, they took the person who sold 70% of the work and was very quiet. Over 20 years, this became the best performing client I ever worked with. They went from losing money and being a $6 or $8 million company with a negative net worth to one that was doing 60 million and making 40%, and did that 3 years in a row. I've never seen anything like it. Um, it was critical to their success. It was a big deal every year as to who got on the board. Every year when we did the business planning, we had the shareholders elect the board, uh, elect the directors, and then the directors name the CEO. And that got rather political, but
Mm-hmm.
it was a very successful, change in the company.
Okay. So in the scenario where an owner might have enough stock to just vote themselves onto the board,
Mhm.
what is a good strategy to either replace them with the best contributor, or I guess you'd want to avoid watering it down by having too many people on it.
Well, it's a good place to start adding some outsiders. I think that's is an opportunity, and they may help rein that person in or give them some guidance or show them a better way to behave if they're not behaving properly. On the other hand, it's naive to think that whoever's got the largest investment in the firm's not going to want to be on the board. I would certainly understand that and expect that. So you
Sure.
can vote shares. If you don't like their direction, maybe you need to buy their ownership back or some of it.
Okay. To get more diversity on your board of directors, which I think is something a lot of firms are really striving to do here. Would you suggest an application process, or any other way to open that up to people who aren't traditionally on boards that you've worked with?
Oh, I don't know if it's an application process. I don't know that somebody good wants to quote apply for your director job. That may be a little much to ask. You may need to sell them on why they need to be part of your organization. I think it's a nomination process. You've got to go look for these people. If you feel like you need a female perspective, go find successful women either in this business or another business that seems like there's a connection with our business that could contribute. It's just a matter of what your directors, your owners are going to do to try to find these people. That's what I think.
you know what would your expectation as an outside board member be for the norm of commitment? How do you leverage the knowledge that person can bring more than just one day a quarter?
Well, I think you do it by having these monthly calls and by sending out information continuously and by serving as mentors for the CEO at a minimum and perhaps other people in the company at a certain level who need help. That's how you do it. You've got to be interacting continuously, not cutting them off from the information flow. Again, I mean, consider situations where I've been an outside director. I get no information along the way. I travel 3,000 miles to a board meeting. I show up at the board meeting, and then the financials are slapped down in front of us, and it's a disaster. Is that really the best way to use the talent of your outside directors when they could have had some outside warning? They could have been asking more questions and figuring out what was going on along the way and maybe be in a better position to actually make a meaningful contribution based on facts at the meeting.
So I'll give a shout out to Mike and Joe from Mulhorn and Culp up there in Philly. I see that you guys have a couple questions. I'm going to get to them right now, but I just wanted to say hey to you guys. Can you, and you may have covered this, they came in a little bit late, point out some key differences as far as topics that are discussed at a regular shareholder or principal meeting versus the regular board meetings?
Yeah, first off, the shareholder or principal meeting, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, typically that's a once a year affair. And maybe you present the results of the year where they're not making any real decisions there. They're not deciding who gets to be the next owner. They're not setting company policy. They're not uh, divvying up the bonus pool as to how much of it we're going to retain and how much we're going to pay out to owners and how much we're going to pay to employees. If they're doing those things, it's not the right, place to do it. I mean, the shareholders are shareholders. They should be entitled to vote. One share equals one vote toward the board of directors. They should get appreciation in their equity if the firm performs, and they should get their pro rata profit distributions if the firm performs based on their investment. And the more you try to drag all owners into management decision making, the bigger disaster you're going to have. It's going to slow everything down, and I don't think it's going to accomplish anything. I don't know if that answers the question, but there I see a major line there between the two. And I will agree, however, that in many cases it's very blurry. I don't think that's the best way to be, though.
We've got a lot of great questions, so thank you guys for bringing them in. We'll keep hitting them off as we can. So one came in wondering about your perspective on the importance of unanimous votes on the board. Is there a time for dissension, and how should that play out inside and outside of the boardroom?
That's a good question. I mean, yes, there is time for dissension, and that dissension could be dealt with either through individual discussions of board members with each other, that are not scheduled, and that's very, very common. That certainly is one way, or prior to quote taking a vote on the issue to work to achieve the consensus. I do think the consensus is important to be able to get that in the end. I don't expect everybody's going to always have the same ideas on exactly what needs to be done. That's okay. That's why you have a discussion. That's why you talk these things out. That's why you get more information if it's needed. Does that make sense?
Does. So switching over to a board structure question, how are boards for say 100% ESOP firms going to differ than a traditional privately owned firm?
Oh, wow. Well, that was one of the problems we had at Ellerby Beckett when I got on their board. We had an ESOP. The ESOP owned all of the ownership interest. Um, we decided that was not the best way to run the business. And we, in fact, got some of the stock back from the ESOP and then sold it to key managers, including the CEO. Um, it's difficult to govern. I'm not going to say I'm an expert in ESOP companies. There really aren't that many of them out there that have 100% ESOP. So it's difficult. The problem becomes they're sort of not owned by anybody. The shares are owned by a trust, and the trust has its own board of governors, and the shares in the trust are then held by employees, in their pension or profit sharing or retirement fund. That's how the ESOP works. And so what happens is, when everybody's got 0.5%, 0.3% of the ownership in their retirement account, typically the firm, in my experience, and some ESOP people will disagree with me, it's like trying to have a discussion about religion with somebody when you get into this whole ESOP issue. The real ESOP advocates are like they're very zealous about their passion for the ESOP. But my experience is when nobody really feels like they have a significant ownership stake, the performance may tend to degenerate, and the firm may become more short-term focused. The individuals are more about what am I going to get out of it now? And that's not necessarily a good mindset to have in this business, because typically to grow a firm, you need to do things differently than one that's just trying to make the best living it can for its owners along the way. I mean, those two things may be divergent at some point. And so, I like companies where their individuals do have significant stakes outside of the ESOP. I think they're more willing to make sacrifices for a bigger pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Although, there are studies that show ESOP companies may be, on average, more profitable by a percentage point that I have seen. It doesn't mean they grow at the same rate, however. Not to say that there aren't other reasons to have an ESOP. It may be the best way to take out a very large shareholder, a founder, on a pre-tax basis. So there are some tax advantages once you go over a certain percentage of ownership. But it definitely complicates the functioning of the business and the board, and requires some different accounting and annual appraisal and some other things that have some costs associated with them.
So this is probably one that we've covered, but let's reaffirm our thinking a little bit. At what size would you recommend transitioning to a board of directors? And then similarly, what size would you recommend seeking that outside board of directors? Is there a difference there?
I'd have a board right off the bat. And I would add some outsiders. I mean, I've been an outsider on a board. There were two partners and me in the smallest one of these cases I was ever involved in. But yeah, I mean, let's get the best resources that you can garner for the firm, and having an outsider. More than one. I mean, maybe we've got a 5-person board and it's got 2 outsiders on it, and we're just starting out. I mean, how wouldn't that be advantageous to you other than the cost? And maybe there's a way to work that out. So there's no cash outlay for these people. Maybe they would take a very small ownership stake or options, or maybe they'll just do it because they like you. I've certainly seen cases where there was no compensation for the outside directors. They're just people who wanted to see this firm be successful. So I hope I answered your question. I'd do it right away. I'd have a board, I'd function as a board, and I would have probably one outsider at a minimum on it from the get-go.
And going back to a previous question about a potential application process,
Yeah.
we talked, I think, externally, but internally, how do you feel about an internal person applying to the board?
I think you should open it up to anybody who wants to, I guess, if they're inside the company. I guess the only risk is if you reject them, that somehow they feel they've been slighted. That's the only potential danger there is if they aren't put on the board, then they could feel like it's some sort of a vote of no confidence in them or some sort of a rejection.
Sure. Well, if there were any more last questions, if you guys want to get them in the chat, I know that we only have a few minutes left remaining, and we'll try to get everybody off here at a timely manner so you can get back to your day. I know a lot of these lunch sessions are good for us because we're available, but you also got to work your lunch in sometimes too.
I'm certainly willing to talk with anybody about any of this stuff if you think I could be helpful. My email address is mzweig, just M like my first initial Zweig, at zweiggroup, one word.com. And then my cell phone number is 508 380 0469. So feel free to call, text, or email me if there's anything I could do to help you guys in any way with this issue.
Hey, Mark, go ahead and
Yes.
click to your next slide. I think your contact information is right there.
Okay, there you go. Good.
And another thing that I'll add is that Zweig Group offers a board of directors search service. What we actually work with a defined group of board level experienced AE professionals around the U.S. And can match you with the appropriate need that you guys might have. So as far as wondering, when is that good time to explore an external board member? That time is now, and you can get a hold of us, and we can help you find the best match for that. Oftentimes, those are not going to be local people, but as far as the board of directors goes, we know that we want to keep a macro view of things, and having somebody outside of your area or your industry or expertise can be very valuable.
Yeah, I think that's a very unique service that we provide there to this industry. I'm unaware of anybody else who does it, but it is something to check out. And we like to help. There are people out there who want to help. They feel they still have a lot to offer. Maybe they're retired, maybe they're in another business, and they just enjoy the intellectual stimulation. Working with design firms and people who own these companies. It's very gratifying. And you guys are a fantastic group of people who are trying to do something good for the world. And I think it's very rewarding for these outside directors and refreshing to them in many cases to work with businesses who do have such high ideals. And so don't think that we don't have anything to offer these board members, these outside directors.
Sure. One last question came in. For a smaller firm, say 50 to 100 people, how large should that board be, in your opinion?
Oh, it's hard to say. I don't know, 5, maybe 7 people. I wouldn't say it should be any larger than that. When I've been on some boards of some very large companies that had, 7 or 8, 9 people at most. I don't think it needs to be more than maybe 9 people in any case for any size company. We're not trying to run Chrysler Corporation or something. When I start seeing vice chairman titles, that's the first thought that comes to my mind. Is this is like a $72 billion a year enterprise? Let's not get too carried away with it and make it too big of a deal in terms of the people having too many on there. It's not going to help,
Mhm.
is the bottom line. It just doesn't help. It just slows everything down. More people you involve. I've seen studies done that actually showed the more people who are involved in certain decisions, the worse the quality of the decision was. Believe it or not, it doesn't improve the quality of decision making necessarily to have more people involved. It can reduce it.
Sure. Well, then let's take this extra 5 minutes and get it back to you guys. Let everyone wrap up and then return to your afternoons. But we encourage you guys to reach out to Mark or even myself to talk a little bit about board of directors strategy further, and then potentially even what we could do to help you find that next board member for your team.